Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our newest addition to the NICU Parent Network webinar series, Got Donor Milk, What NICU Parents Need to Know About New Safety Concerns. NICU Parent Network is a collaborative of NICU support organizations led by NICU parent professionals. We are the only professional association for NICU parent leaders in the United States. NPN provides a platform for these leaders to come together as a collective voice representing the needs and best interests of NICU families in all facets of healthcare policy, care guidelines, advocacy, education, and family support. Today's webinar is the first in a series highlighting our industry collective. Our industry collective remains actively engaged with our membership. They work alongside NPN and individual support organizations, providing firsthand knowledge regarding the unique needs and challenges faced by NICU parents. For this webinar, we are honored to highlight Prolacta Bioscience, who would like to talk to us today about the growth of human milk industry and the corresponding safety implications that come with the growth of a biologic product. We will examine the growth in both the volume of human milk donation and the number of companies with new manufacturing processes in human milk. If you have questions or comments at any time throughout the webinar, we invite you to use the chat function on your screen. I'll be monitoring the chat box and we'll pause at the end to answer any questions you may have. We want you as leaders to have the opportunity to discuss the value and risk of human milk for the most fragile infants in the NICU. The webinar is being recorded, so don't worry if you have to step away for a moment or leave. You will receive a link to the recording within the week. You will also be able to view our past webinars by visiting our website, NICUparentnetwork.org. We hope that you will see them, and what we present here today is as valuable resources that you need. I'm Jennifer Deagle, and I will be your host for today. Very quickly, my daughter was born at 23 weeks gestation back in 2012, and she spent 121 days in the NICU. I became a member of the NICU Parent Network a few years after her birth, and I now serve on the board of directors, and I'm very happy to be participating today. I've also personally experienced a tour of Prolacta Bioscience in California and all the amazing work that they're doing. With us today, we have Dr. Melinda Elliott. Dr. Elliott joined Prolacta Bioscience in 2016 and is currently serving as their Chief Medical Officer. She also continues to serve as a neonatologist with Pediatrics Medical Group. Dr. Elliott holds a faculty position at Samuelson Children's Hospital in Sinai in Baltimore. She has researched the benefits of exclusive human milk diet for VLBW premature infants in the NICU and is published in academic journals. She is an experienced neonatologist, educator, and leader in neonatal intensive care. Dr. Elliott earned her MD degree from WVU School in Medicine and completed training in pediatrics and neonatal perinatal medicine at the University of Florida. We also have Scott Aker with us today. Scott Aker joined Prolacta Bioscience in 2007 and currently serves as Prolacta's Chief Operations Officer. Scott is responsible for Prolacta's manufacturing, milk resourcing, quality, supply chain, and regulatory affairs. He has also over 20 years of experience in bioscience and nutrition sectors. Scott began his career in microbiology laboratory at Baxter's first recombinant factor VIII manufacturing facility. He supported the startup of the bulk manufacturing fill finish operations, implemented numerous test protocols, led failure investigations, and rapidly became a supervisor of laboratory operations. Scott also held a role serving as a subject manager expert in the areas of microbiology and aseptic processing for Baxter. In this position, he was responsible for developing and deploying standardized quality systems across multiple biologic and medical device manufacturing facilities in the US and Europe. Scott was also responsible for the quality and plasma fractionation area and ultimately served as the director of quality technical support for the bioscience division at Baxter. Scott received a Bachelor of Science degree in microbiology from the University of California at Davis. But last and certainly not least, we have California Tanek, who is a Senior Director in Advocacy and Government Affairs at Prolacta. Carolyn will wrap up the webinar with some ideas and next steps you can take as parent leaders in the preemie community. Though Carolyn needs no introduction to most of us at all, under the leadership of two preemie companies since 2008, as an experienced RN, Carolyn's dedication to NPN and the families we serve is not just part of her job at Prolacta, it's her mission, and Carolyn stops to no end to make sure families thrive well past the doors of the NICU. We are excited to talk about donor milk and how we can use the information we're given today to advocate in our NICU community. So let's go ahead and jump right in, and I'll start and turn this over to Dr. Elliott. Welcome, Dr. Elliott. Thank you for joining us. We're so thankful to have you with us today.
Thank you, Jen. I really appreciate the opportunity. And thank you so much to the NPN for this opportunity to talk about human milk safety and its importance in critically ill babies. Next slide, please. I think that everyone on this call understands the importance of human milk for critically ill infants. And I think we all know that human milk is best for all babies. And mother's own milk is the preferred milk to feed all newborns, including those born prematurely. But not every mom, for whatever reason, is able to produce enough milk for her baby. Sometimes she just needs a little extra, sometimes she can't make any, and that's all okay. Every infant should be given the opportunity to have nothing but human milk, particularly when they're critically ill, whether from being born very prematurely or being born and needing surgery immediately after birth. But I think, as we've seen in over 35 published clinical studies, that the evidence on the advantages of human milk for babies is clearly shown. In the premature infant population, we've seen over and over reductions in necrotizing enterocolitis, reductions in the need for surgery for NEC, decreases in sepsis, in retinopathy of prematurity, in bronchopulmonary dysplasia, decreases in the use of TPN, and decreases in feeding intolerance, and probably really important just as well is the decrease in the length of stay in the NICU and the chance for these babies to get home faster. But in addition to these NICU benefits that happen right after birth, there is more emerging evidence that long-term neurodevelopmental outcomes are actually improved by using human milk-based fortifiers instead of cow milk-based ones. Having said that, that sort of elevates human milk to a level of milk being medicine. If human milk can actually impact all these outcomes in small and ill babies, then it is more than just food, it is medicine. And the data actually clearly support this. Mom's milk is what we need first. And if that's not enough to feed the baby in quantity, then we need human donor milk to supplement that. But I think, as many of you are more than aware, no matter how hard mom tries and no matter what she does, prematurely born infants, and frequently those that need surgery, even if born full term, need extra fortification over and above what mom can provide in her milk. And because of those factors, we need to have a human milk-based fortification that is available to all sick newborns, and this should be standard of care. These fortifiers have to be safe, the donor milk has to be safe, and it should be made from pasteurized human milk. Now, next slide, please. As this beautiful graphic from the NPA shows us, the human milk alone is not just food. It's got a lot of factors in it that make it just vitally important for newborns. There's protein, there's fat, there are cells in mother's milk, but it's much like a blood product or a plasma product. Yes, it's predominantly water, but it's what those other parts are. The proteins, the fats, the carbohydrates, those are so important to have their bioactivity to help babies grow and be strong and develop normally. Having said that, just like blood and plasma, human milk is not without risk if it's not processed appropriately. It is a great medium for bacteria and viruses to grow, and other things can be present in human milk that, if they're not tested for, we don't know that they're there and could be inadvertently fed to small babies. Next slide, please. So just like in the blood and plasma industry, you have to screen for these things, and most milk banks screen for all of them. So they screen by asking the donors if they have any of these risk factors. Do they smoke? Do they take any illegal drugs? most milk banks absolutely do a pretty exhaustive screening questionnaire to help find donors who are healthy and from whom their milk is quite acceptable for use in sick premature infants. Most of them test the blood of the donors for various viruses, bacteria, and other infectious diseases to assure that that woman is free of illness at the time she's donating her milk. And additionally, most milk banks also get certification from the mother's physician and the baby's physician that both are healthy, that the baby's breastfed, and that this is indeed excess donor milk. Give me the next slide, please. So as you see in this slide, though, there is a big difference between screening and testing. So pretty much every milk bank does screening. That means they ask the donors these questions. They test the donor's blood at the time that she is cleared to donate, and they get an okay from the doctor. That is very different from actually testing the milk. At Prolacta, we test all of the milk that comes into the facility to look for pathogens, to look for infectious diseases, and to look for adulterants, as well as to look for other kinds of drugs and substances that might be harmful to sick newborn infants. Now, when I say testing, what do I mean by that? Well, we're actually doing a test on the milk. Now, these tests that we use at Prolacta are actually commercially available. They're not Prolacta-owned tests. We use these tests, and they're validated for use in breast milk, and they have been accepted as an approved way to test for products in the milk itself. It is not required for other milk banks to actually test the raw milk. Some do, some don't. And there is no sort of oversight requiring this testing of the milk. At Prolacta, we believe that the products we produce need to be as safe as is possible, because the babies that receive them are very tiny or very sick. Next slide, please. Now, when I say testing versus screening, why does it matter? Because someone might say, well, we only get from moms who pass all of our testing. Well, that is true, but there is a problem called seroconversion. And I really don't want to scare everybody, because the incidence of this happening is not super high, but at Prolacta, we believe that it is vitally important to make sure this isn't happening. So what is seroconversion? Well, let's say you test a donor's blood. She fills out her questionnaire. She passes all the questions, and you then draw her blood and assess for things like HIV, for example. And she's negative, which is great. That means she has the potential to be a donor. Her blood is not retested for 4 to 6 months, and that only assumes that she actually redonates in 4 to 6 months. If she doesn't ever become a donor again, she will not be retested again. But she could theoretically develop the infection. She could get infected with HIV and still be pumping milk during that 4 to 6 months. If the milk is not tested, we will never know that there is actually HIV in the milk. So at Prolacta, we feel that it's vitally important to not only test the donor's blood every 4 to 6 months, but to double check by testing the milk. Additionally, at Prolacta, we're constantly changing our testing. And I'm pretty sure everybody on this call is aware of a little virus called SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19. And while it does appear that COVID-19 is eliminated through appropriate pasteurization, we at Prolacta have been working on developing a test for SARS-CoV-2, which we have done, and we screen all of our milk additionally for SARS-CoV-2 to assure that it is not in the milk that's being processed for NICUs. Additionally, chemicals are hugely important. And when I say chemicals, I mean things like marijuana or nicotine. Those things are bad to be given to our NICU patients, and so we need to make sure that they are not in the milk. Well, most milk banks might tell you that we ask our moms if they smoke, and they all say no, and we don't take moms that smoke. So if you show the next slide, please. Let's just use smoking as an example. Yes, women are asked if they smoke when they try to become donors. And we know, for example, based on studies, that 1 in 5 breastfeeding moms actually resume smoking by 8 weeks postpartum. So that means if those women are resuming smoking and they're still donating, they rightly answered and honestly answered no when they filled out their questionnaire. But if they resume smoking, there's no one asking them if they resume smoking. Additionally, we also know from studies that by 4.5 months, 2 in 5 women actually relapse for smoking. You'll also hear people say that milk banks that compensate their donors for their time and effort to donate the milk actually are at higher risk. And the science doesn't bear that out either. If you see that chart in the middle of the slide, we looked at donors who were compensated for their time and effort versus those who were not. And I think you will see that the percentage of those that actually had nicotine contamination in their milk is identical. And honestly, I think it's because the women who are getting compensated for this value that compensation. We've heard of many stories of some of our donors that it's allowed them to pay off NICU bills, for example, or allowed them to make house payments, and they want to continue to be donors, and they want to be good donors. And they generally want to donate to Prolacta because they know they're helping NICU babies. And it's a very sort of fulfilling thing for them to be able to do that. Next slide, please. And so some people might ask, they say, well, pasteurization kills everything, right? And you know what? Pasteurization kills most things. Pasteurization is the process that the milk banks up until now have been using, whether it's Holder pasteurization, which is used by the Himbana milk banks, or whether it's VAT pasteurization, which is used by Prolacta. Those pasteurization processes are very, very similar. The VAT pasteurization process is actually we have detailed guidance from the pasteurized milk ordinance that is put out by the FDA that Prolacta follows carefully. Holder pasteurization is not quite as directly overseen, but Holder pasteurization is sort of a tried and true method. All of the clinical studies that you may be aware of showing the benefits of exclusive human milk have been done on pasteurized milk products, whether it's been Holder pasteurized or VAT pasteurized. There are new processes coming out. One is called retort processing. And it is actually currently has been used in the past in the food canning industry. It is effective in sterilizing milk. It makes it shelf stable. Unfortunately, the combination of temperature and pressure that is used to retort sterilize a product actually destroys many of the important proteins that are present in human milk. Now, none of these processes do anything for what we call small molecule contaminants like THC from marijuana, for example. THC sticks around in milk if it's there. So it's another important reason to actually test the raw milk and make sure that THC is not there, particularly in view of the fact that more and more states are actually legalizing marijuana. And so it's actually not illegal for someone to use marijuana. So why wouldn't we be seeing it more? So it's really important that we're not giving milk to sick newborns that has THC or marijuana in it. And none of these processes do anything to do that. Additionally, while these processes do destroy live organisms that might be contaminating the milk, some of those organisms make something called an enterotoxin, which causes diarrhea. And if the enterotoxin is already in the milk, these processes will not destroy that either. So it is also important to test for those enterotoxins. Next slide, please. Sort of the last thing I want to bring up is these new products, like I mentioned, this retort sterilization process, which is similar to food canning. It doesn't have any evidence in its use in premature infants. Now, this really funny looking slide is actually what we call an electrophoresis slide. And what you're looking at, if you look at the top, you'll see across the top are names of different products. And on the right are names of certain substances like immunoglobulin is what IG is, or lactoferrin. And those are names of proteins that are in human milk. And whenever you see a dark blue line, that means that protein is present in the sample. But when you don't see a dark blue line, it means that protein is not present in the sample. So what this slide actually shows is if you look at the Prolacta products, which are toward the right, excuse me, I have to put my reading glasses on. The far right slide is what we call a marker, which tells us where these different proteins layer out. And then from the right, the next two columns are Prolacta donor milk, for example. And you'll see really heavy dark blue lines that match up where lactoferrin and immunoglobulin and serum albumin are. And then you'll notice the next four lines, the next four columns, or I should say. Those are actually samples from one of the retort sterilized milk banks. And you'll notice no dark blue lines. That means that those intact immunoglobulin lines, lactoferrin lines, albumin lines, casein lines, alpha-lactobumin lines, they are not intact in those products. The processing has destroyed those intact proteins, which tells me we don't know if the benefits from these human milk products are nearly as good as the ones that have been published in the literature. So that's sort of my message to you all as leaders and for parent groups, is that we have to empower our parents to ask the questions. You know, in this incredibly stressful situation, we want to empower you and give you the information that you need to just ask the questions. Do you know the milk you're giving my baby has as much bioactivity as possible? Is it safe? Is it tested? And on that note, I'm going to transition over to Scott Aker, who is going to tell you a lot more about quality and safety.
Thanks, Melinda. So I want to touch first on the regulation of human milk in the US. So human milk is regulated in a variety of different ways, depending on the type of product we're talking about. For example, our products are regulated as exempt infant formula. Donor milk with no additional processing other than cooling and pasteurization is typically handled as a food. Now, where the line is between food and infant formula is not entirely clear with respect to what the FDA has published, but it is clear that products like ours, where you are pooling the milk, you are processing the milk, concentrating it, adding things to it like necessary minerals, those things fall into exempt infant formula. And why is that important? Well, exempt infant formula has a much higher bar with respect to quality, safety, and manufacturing requirements at the FDA. For example, we are required for infant formula products to notify the FDA of any new products, new processes, new facilities, major changes that might occur, and go through a review process with the FDA before we can implement those things. The other thing that's important to know about infant formula is that there are very clear requirements in the infant formula world for clinical data, meaning that you cannot bring a product, an exempt infant formula product, into the NICU without having done clinical trials showing that it's nutritionally sufficient and also that it is safe. And as Melinda pointed out, with products that are processed with novel processes like retort processing, the understanding of whether those are sufficient for the infant or even safe for the infant should be done through a clinical research program. However, since those products have traditionally been considered only food products, that's not required by the FDA to do. Now, there are other types of regulation of human milk in the US. There are 3 states currently that look at human milk as a tissue, no different than a solid organ or something like that. That's California, Maryland, and New York. And there are additional regulations that those 3 states have put in place specific to human milk banking to ensure that the products that are sold in their state are absolutely safe. Next slide. But the bottom line is that currently donor human milk is regulated just like any other food product that you would buy off the shelf. And when you look at the two pictures below, you can see on the left that you've got two kids that are drinking your traditional cow's milk product. And then on the right, you've got a baby in the NICU. Well, the truth is that right now, from the FDA's point of view, there's actually more regulation of the product on the left through both the FDA and the USDA. There's more regulation of that than there is of the products that are used in the NICU that are human milk based, but are not fortifiers like ours. And we really don't think that that's an appropriate level of regulation for something that's so critical for its use in the NICU. Next slide. So some states have recognized this and are in process or have implemented legislation that says we at least want to have a registration and licensing of milk banks that are either operating in our state or are bringing products into our state. So currently we have states like Arkansas and New Jersey and Pennsylvania that have said, we're not considering a tissue, but we are going to require registration and licensing of these milk banks. And we're going to look at, from our Department of Health is going to look at what are the right requirements for milk banks to have to comply with in order to be considered safe for use in our state. And then there are additional states, Florida, Virginia, and South Carolina, that are somewhere in the process. They have legislation that's pending and is being discussed, but they haven't actually gone to the point of approving that legislation and getting into the full regulatory process. What types of testing? What's the registration look like? Are we going to inspect these facilities? Those types of questions. Next slide. So this is a recognition that biological materials need to have a higher level of oversight than the typical food that you see in the grocery store, or that you might be even serving to adults, even if it's in a medical food situation. And so there is a need for us to support our legislators when they come forward and say, we'd really like to get our arms around who's operating in our state, what are the products that they're selling, and what are the requirements for those products to ensure that they are safe and effective. Next slide. This also is important because we're not really living in a world where we have a few small nonprofit milk banks, self-regulated, that are providing milk to a limited number of hospitals. As you can see from this slide, since 2001, when Prolacta was first established as an entity until today, there's been pretty tremendous growth in the industry. On the bottom, what you can see are all of the nonprofit milk banks that are generally in the Humana fold. And on the top, you can see the establishment of commercial milk banks like Prolacta, Medolac, and others. And you can see starting in about 2010, there really was a huge uptick in the number of milk banks and the introduction of additional commercial entities that are playing in this space. That's a recognition of a number of things. Number one, there was a lot of data that came out over the past 20 years supporting the use of human milk, donor milk, when mom's milk is not available in the NICU, to get the best outcomes for your preterm infants. And then also in around 2010, there were studies published using our fortifiers that really showed that an exclusive human milk diet, including the fortifier, has additional benefit beyond using just mom's milk, donor milk, and cow's milk based fortifier. And you can see after that, there was really a huge uptick in the number of milk banks established. We continue to see additional companies that are not really fully commercially established, but are beginning to be out there. Companies that are using unique processes, retort processing, ultra high temperature pasteurization like you would use on creamers, and also creating powders of human milk and looking to use those in the NICU as either a fortifier or basically a shelf-stable donor milk. So this continues to grow. And the one thing that we know is that as an industry really starts to hit its stride and grow at a exponential pace, the risk of errors, accidents, and mishaps really goes up. And that's when you tend to see regulators start to step in and say, we need to get our hands around this, and we need to understand what are the right requirements to create a base level of safety, no matter where you're buying your donor milk or your human milk-based products. Next slide. And this slide really points out the kind of rapid expansion of not only the number of milk banks, but the amount of milk that's being collected and distributed. So this is data that comes from Humana and only Humana, and goes up to 2019. And you can see year over year, the number of ounces that are being collected and distributed by the nonprofit milk banks is really growing, maybe not exponentially, but it's growing at a rapid pace. And we know from looking at data that was just released not too long ago, about 2020, that there was no negative impact to milk collection in 2020. In fact, milk banks are saying that they had a fantastic year of milk collection. So we would expect when we amend this graph and add 2020 to it, that we're going to see another big jump in the amount of milk collected and distributed. We have no data on all of the other commercial entities. I can certainly say for Prolacta, our year over year growth is going to look very similar. We definitely have year over year growth in the amount of milk that we collect and the amount of product that we can distribute. And you can see that represented in the graph that's right behind me of milk collection up through 2018. We don't know what the other milk banks, that the commercial milk banks are doing, but we also expect that they are probably growing, maybe at a slightly slower pace, but they are also growing. And as that happens, we know others are going to want to move into this space. And we need to have regulations that tell them how to operate to ensure that premature infants are safe. Next slide. So how can NPN help with this? Well, certainly we've got a number of states that we've highlighted that have legislation in place, states that are looking to put legislation in place. And then there are others that are just not in the right legislative part of their cycle to be working on this, but will be working on it in the 2022 or 2023, and certainly supporting rational registration, licensing, and baseline quality requirements for milk banks operating in various states would be incredibly helpful. And your voice is certainly more important than our voice when it comes to this. As individuals who have gone through this journey in the NICU, when you say the product needs to be safe, the legislators listen to you. And also, ultimately, we believe that there should be a federal legislation around this that establishes what are the minimum requirements in any state for milk banks to be able to operate and to sell products into the NICU or even into well baby nurseries. And so while that is still a very slow process, we do see movement in that area and interest at the federal legislative level. And there are conversations that are going on between FDA and Congress right now to talk about how do we achieve that in the easiest and least costly way possible. And now I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn to talk a little bit more about how NPN can actually physically help in the support of these things.
Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Melinda. Our advocacy team has talked to many of you individually about these concerns over many months, and we've heard your questions, and we wanted to bring our experts to you today to provide additional context so that you, as leaders, could then provide those to your parents to empower them, as Melinda said, to know their options, to ask the right questions. So many times we know that parents don't understand what their options really are, and we want to make sure that they do. So we want to talk to you about some next steps and what some of this legislation would and wouldn't do, so that we're very clear about that. We don't certainly want to grant a monopoly. We want to make an even playing field so that everyone is safe. so that all these babies and all the different products that are being sold out there in the NICU or on the horizon have to go through the same kind of rigor in order to make sure that our babies are safe. Many of you have come to our tours and you know what we do. We go the extra mile and we always will. And we want to make sure that everyone that comes into this space has the same type of expectation, that they must meet the highest quality standards for the most fragile patients. Next slide. So to summarize what we have talked about today, human milk as a biologic can and does transmit viruses, bacteria, and adulterants, exactly like blood and plasma. There are no mandatory safety measures that govern human milk. As we speak, we are trying to change some of that. Screening, as Melinda so greatly described, isn't testing. It's simply screening, but it's not testing the end product. There's a variety of donor milk banks operating in states, and this is a new day in our history. This industry, because of the clinical efficacy that we see in these babies, and the decade of data that Prolacta has either been directly involved in or following, we know that this is only going to continue to rise. It must become the standard of care for babies. We need your help in that. But as it does, we also must make sure that it's safe. So as these organizations become operational and selling across the country and indeed across the globe, we must make sure that, again, everyone must meet minimum safety standards. They have to disclose their processes. They must participate in clinical trials before putting a product in these fragile babies. It's just incredible to think that right now, as we speak, new companies are approaching hospital administrators and NICU staffs and saying, look, these are fine. This is human milk. Do you have any clinical data? No, but hey, it's human milk. So just, go with it because it's cheaper, because it's shelf stable, it'll stay around for longer, it's easier to manage. Whatever their sales pitch is not sufficient. We also know, as that one great slide shows so well, it's like you can't even replace that slide, that the nutritional properties of human milk are just absolutely blotted out in those sterilized or retort heat induced products processes. Next slide. So how can NPN individually individual members as well as you as an organization help us? Well, certainly, let's continue the dialogue, discuss the risks of unregulated donor milk with your colleagues. We can help you with information, feature it on your websites, in social media, write letters of support of safety. Again, either as individual members or organizations, work with us and our advocacy team. We can help you with some of that information. Perhaps produce a position statement that would require parents to understand and have empowered rights to safe human milk products. Discourage hospitals if you work within them as a member or as a mentor or as an organization that supports them, to be on guard that these products do reduce bioavailability. They are not supported by clinical data. And you, as those who support the parents throughout this country, really have concern that until there is clinical data, that we really not move forward with that. And certainly the most important thing that we want to do is not dictate any kind of mandates or what you would tell people, but certainly parents, as you know so well, because you are parents, you went through this, to know what your choices are, and so that you can make informed choices. And there's a lot hitting these parents, as you know so well. during this journey. And nutrition should not be one of those things that's complicated or complex. It should be very straightforward. Next slide. So again, how can we help you? And we will help you. Just reach out to myself or Mike or Mark. And we will certainly follow up and provide all of our emails to you. We can help you draft templates, get you started. We can assist in editing, making sure the science and the clinical information is correct. We don't want to put words in your mouth. We want your words to ring true as parents. As states or any federal legislation comes about, we certainly will be in contact with you and have been working with many of you in states that have had legislation on and bills in process. And then you can provide those critical talking points to legislators moving forward. And last but not least, the NPN could certainly develop a science-based policy statement, again, based on the science, based on the clinical research, based on the evidence. So those would be our suggestions, and we are delighted to work with you on any and all of those. Next slide. We know we have thrown a lot at you today, and there are a lot of questions in queue. So I'll just turn it back to Jen to moderate the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott, Melinda, and Carolyn for that. That was so, so powerful to learn all of that information. And on a personal note, being a science teacher, I just love everything that you explained. And I think you explained it all in such a way that most of the parents can understand pretty clearly now how the process works. So I want to thank you for that. We do have a couple of questions here. So I'll start with one of our first ones. And it says, why doesn't the FDA regulate human donor milk? So who wants to take that one?
I can take that. Thanks, Jennifer. I think I would phrase it slightly differently. FDA does feel that they regulate donor human milk because they regulate it as a food, and that by defining it as a food, just like every other food that is produced in the U.S., there are some baseline requirements to ensure that those products are safe. And we all see the things that go on with the FDA in terms of monitoring for foodborne illness, and even down to how food is handled in restaurants, temperatures, and that sort of thing, to make sure that that product is going to be safe when it hits your plate. The problem is that historically, food regulation has been very much driven by the company. You do your own assessment of risk, you establish what you think the controls are, and you put those controls in place. And the FDA, at some frequency, may come into your plant and look at what you're doing. But if you are considered a reasonably low risk manufacturer, you may never see the FDA. And so you're left up to your own devices to determine what should you do and what's important and how do you deal with those risks. What we're saying is that human donor milk is under-regulated by the FDA, because just like any other food given to infants or children, there should be a higher standard applied than the typical, lunch meat that's produced and goes into your grocery store. For infant formula, that's why I was highlighting some of the key things. It's the notification, the pre-market notification that you need to do, which is a discussion and handshake with the FDA. You're saying, we've evaluated the risk, here they are. Do you agree with this? The clinical data requirements to bring products to market to show that they are nutritionally sufficient for their intended use, that they are safe, and that you have the appropriate controls in there to ensure that they remain safe on an ongoing basis. And then the heightened level of inspection and scrutiny that occurs by the FDA. We get the great pleasure of seeing the FDA once every 2 years. They come into our facility. They spend anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks with us, walking through our facility, inspecting all of our processes, looking at all of our documentation, and then coming away and saying, yes, we understand what you're doing and we agree that it is sufficient to ensure the safety of these products that go to these critical infants. So I just want to change the conversation a little bit. It's not about it not being regulated. It is. Our point is we believe it's under-regulated.
Understood. Thank you. I'm sure most of us would agree. Another interesting question, and maybe Dr. Elliott, you can take this one because you addressed some of it earlier. Have you found an increase of marijuana in donor milk? It's become a concern for us in the States of just, different legislation has been passing. So someone's curious if you've seen that.
So that is a super fantastic question, because I think there's a whole lot of literature devoted right now to that exact problem. You'll hear everything from marijuana is not a danger to anybody to marijuana is damaging to teenage brains, which we've actually seen some good data about that. So that takes me even further to, if it's damaging to teenage brains, which are much better developed than, say, the brain of a 25-weeker, what might marijuana do to that little guy's brain? So the short answer is that for the most part, no, we haven't seen a large increase at all. I mean, and Scott's shaking his head, so he's backing me up on this one. But it's a perpetual worry. As more and more states legalize marijuana, we have to find a way to keep it out of the milk supply to the tiniest, most at-risk babies.
I think everybody would agree with that as well. Yeah, thank you for that. We have another question here. As a NICU social worker, how could I encourage my hospital to use donor milk instead of formula? So what suggestions would you have from that perspective?
Oh my, I could go on for days, and perhaps you and I should have a discussion about this. And I'd be happy to do that, by the way. I'd be happy to help you have a discussion. I think that there's a number of approaches. First of all, I suspect, you said you were a social worker, so I suspect that there are nursing managers, directors, and physicians at the hospital who all believe human milk is the way to go for babies. And so, step one is to find yourself a partner or two, and kind of make a united multidisciplinary front, right? Maybe even include a parent or two, and start the process. You've got lots of support. You have the American Academy of Pediatrics statement that came out way back in 2012, saying clearly donor human milk is the replacement or supplement when there is not adequate mother's milk for sick newborns. That was crystal clear, and that was in 2012, so it was 9 years ago. It actually came out at the end of 2011, so it's actually been almost 10 years. That is supported also by the WHO, the Canadian Pediatric Society, the European group of nutritionists, ESPGHAN. It's pretty much supported worldwide that in sick newborns, when there is not sufficient mother's milk for whatever reason, human donor milk should replace it. So that is step one. The next step then after that is to look at the population you are trying to get donor milk for. And obviously the NICU is the easiest one because there's tons of data, but there is even a lot of good data for using donor milk simply as a small supplement to babies in the term nursery whose moms are breastfeeding, basically until mom's milk comes in. And baby-friendly hospitals do that. They don't use formula. There's the 10 steps to successful breastfeeding that Diane Spatz has created and talked about, and has been adapted for the NICU. I mean, I will stop now because I could literally go on for the next hour, but honestly, I'm happy to help you.
So that was from Karen. Karen, why don't you reach out to us at NPN and we'll connect you with Dr. Elliott and you can get all of your resources there. Thank you for that question and all of that information. Another question on the bottom here, it says, is TPN regulated in any ways, particularly in the NICU?
Well, TPN is different because TPN is an intravenous infusion. So TPN stands for total parenteral nutrition, in case people don't know. And that is IV nutrition as opposed to something that you take by mouth or into a feeding tube. And so the regulation for that is completely different. It's not looked at as a food. It is, I mean, Scott may be able to give you some more specifics of how it's regulated. So go ahead, Scott.
Sure. Yeah, and in fact, when I spent quite a bit of time at Baxter, one of the facilities I worked with produced TPN, and it is absolutely regulated as a drug. as they're pretty much any intravenous or injectable products are going to end up being drugs just because of their mode of delivery. One of the things that's challenging about TPN is that there are forms of TPN that are complete ready to go, and maybe just require that you squeeze the two parts together and mix it up and deliver it. But then there's also compounded products, TPN products, and those are a little bit handled a little bit differently. If they're compounded in the pharmacy at the hospital, then they're regulated by FDA, but in a very different way than your standard products produced by a company that are just made to be used as is.
And I'm going to add that in the NICU, TPN is almost universally compounded for each individual baby, whether it's in the hospital or there are, external to hospital TPN providers, but they're still individually ordered compounded TPN for each baby.
It's so fascinating because I think most NICU parents do consider it food because that's the nutrition.
Well, it is.
Told about, right? And it's just regulated differently. It's so fascinating.
Well, and compounding actually is a great example of historical underregulation. I think maybe many of you are familiar with the fact that the FDA did not adequately regulate compounding pharmacies. So pharmacies were able to take drugs and combine them and dilute them and do things with them. And there was a big scandal, a very sad thing that happened where a number of people were given fungal infections through epidural injections through compounded drugs. And the FDA said, we should probably regulate that a little more closely than we are given the risk of it. But for years, the FDA was not given authority to regulate compounded products in the same way that any other injectable product would be regulated. And that's a great example of underregulation and how it can end up hurting or even killing people.
Yeah, that's a very good example. Just one more question for now. It's kind of I guess a double question. But some of the NICU parents are wondering if you could talk about probiotics and prebiotics, maybe their use in the NICU. How does that affect breast milk and nutrition? If anybody wants to share, Dr. Elliott or Scott or Carolyn, go ahead and take that.
I'll take it. So this is yet again another talk I could go on for another hour or so for you, but I'll try to do this in just a couple minutes. So first of all, probiotics are simply bacteria that are or even fungi, for example, but they're living organisms that are beneficial to us. And when we talk about probiotics, we're generally talking about those that are helpful to our intestines or our guts, right? That's what we all talk about. We all take probiotics to have healthy guts. So that's sort of what probiotics are. Now, prebiotics are compounds that feed those good bacteria, okay? So if you, for instance, human milk is kind of the ultimate prebiotic. So in a newborn baby, if you feed a newborn baby human milk and the baby's otherwise healthy, then you don't really have to feed that baby anything but human milk, mother's milk, because it's full of human milk oligosaccharides or HMOs, which are kind of like, the world's greatest prebiotic, because HMOs are sugars that aren't digested by the baby, but that are digested by the good bacteria. So if you feed a baby human milk, there's tons of HMOs. These bacteria in the intestine say, oh, look, there's dinner. And they grow and grow and grow. And you have a healthy gut because you are growing the right good bacteria. Now, when you're in the NICU, as many of you know, you get antibiotics. And I would say many, many, many babies get antibiotics at least for 48 hours for those first couple of days in the NICU, just because the physicians are trying to assure the baby doesn't have an infection, because that's a horrible thing. But that changes the growth of those bacteria in the intestine. And that's where prebiotics or probiotics come in, is that there's a lot of data about giving babies in the NICU the right kind of organisms to grow a healthy gut microbiome. And your microbiome is simply the collection of organisms that grow in your intestines. And so if you're growing the right ones, you're healthy. So probiotics, there's a lot of different ones. there is overall belief that in general, probiotics are good for babies and for everyone. The problem is we do not know which probiotics are best. We do not know whether it's a single one or multiple ones. There are very few studies in premature infants. There are a couple coming out in the US now that are actually being studied in premature infants. There's also, as you might imagine, since these are live bacteria, there are a lot of chances for the wrong bugs to grow. And you have to have high quality and safety, which is a whole different talk about growing the right probiotics, the right organisms, and they have to only be those organisms. So the short answer is that the right probiotics are great, and it makes complete sense to feed human milk and probiotics together for the best outcome. The longer answer is that we're still not sure in the medical community exactly which are the right probiotics and how safe they actually are in this patient population.
That was a great answer and exactly what I would be looking for, because I myself always have the question about that too. And it's always a conversation about probiotics in the NICU that the parents talk about so often. Well, we are almost out of time today, and I just want to say a couple of words. Does anybody on the panel here want to share anything closing before I go ahead and close us out here?
Just thank you for the opportunity to talk to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you. You really brought a wonderful wealth of knowledge to our members, so we're so appreciative of that. Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for taking the time from your busy summer schedules to join us today. All major health organizations, including the Academy of Pediatrics and the World Health Organization, state that breast milk is the healthiest food for babies in their first year of life. And when a mother's own milk is unavailable for preterm or low birth weight infants, pasteurized donor milk is the best thing. So I really want to thank all of our speakers and attendees for allowing us to learn more about this really important topic today so that we can then go and better advocate for our NICU babies. Please visit NICU Parent Network website to learn more about the incredible parent-led organizations who are working every day to improve support for families and the professionals who care for them. If you have further questions or would like to follow up with Prolacta, please email us and we are very happy to connect you so you can get all of the answers that you need. And thank you so much for participating and for our speakers and all the wonderful questions and answers that we got today. Everybody has a great day.